Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from an undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And as a follow-up to last week's episode discussing the history of country music, I thought it would be a good chance to take a deeper dive into the life of the so-called father of country music, and I do believe he truly deserves that title, Jimmie Rodgers. And I can't think of a better way to begin than with his family history, because he definitely had a very interesting. Jimmie's paternal family history is a bit hard to trace. However, what is known is his grandfather, Zachary Rodgers, who spelled his name without the D, was born in Mississippi in 1841 in probably the east central part of the state, and that he moved to the hill country of western Alabama sometime before the Civil War. And later, in 1864, he enlisted, or maybe drafted, into Captain Riv's supporting force, 9th Alabama District, Confederate States of America, and promptly deserted 2 weeks later. However, this act was not only appropriate to the character of Zach Rodgers, as handed down in the family lore, but a fairly wise one and not entirely dishonorable. This attitude was shared by thousands of his fellow Confederates, more than 100 of whom had gone over the hill by 1864. By all accounts, Zach Rodgers was a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner, born and bred son of Dixie. After the war, Zach Rodgers married a woman named Martha Woodbury, a Georgia native, and settled in Choctaw County, Alabama, where he raised mostly cotton, some corn, and many children. The third of these was a son named Aaron Woodbury, born in 1870. Who was a steely-eyed, strong-willed lad who decided he'd spell the name with a D, and left home in his early teens to work as a section hand with the Mobile and Ohio Railroad in Meridian, Mississippi. Young Aaron Rodgers was a willing worker, a bit fast with his fists, perhaps, and he definitely possessed an Irish temper, but he was generally a likable fellow who got along with the men on the section crew and made friends very easily. He also had a quick eye for the ladies. His circle of friends soon contained a number of the local Southern belles. Among them was a 16-year-old named Eliza Bozeman, whose father was a farmer and man of some means in the rural Pine Springs community a few miles northeast of Meridian. Now, Jimmie Rodgers' mother's family, the Bozemans, do have a history that is more well known. Bozemans were natives of Holland, and their name was originally Bosman or Boskman. They settled in Maryland along the eastern banks of Chesapeake Bay before the American Revolution. Later, they migrated south into Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, and west to Alabama and Mississippi and beyond that, following a pattern common to millions of the families, including in all likelihood that of Aaron Rodgers, which eventually populated the Old South. Eliza Bozeman's great-grandfather, Meady Bozeman, settled in Georgia in the 1790s. Her grandfather, whose name was also Meady, married a woman named Lucy Carroll of Carrollton, and moved into central Alabama, where he farmed and acquired a reputation as a very fine mechanic. In the family history of the Bozemans, written by the Reverend Joseph W. Bozeman, it was written, "Houses that he built in Dallas County, Alabama, 50 years ago are still pointed out with pride as the work of Meady Bozeman. A large, fine-looking fellow with blue eyes and a ruddy face, full of life and jest, he was the delight of young people even in his advanced years." Now, Eliza's father, Samuel Bozeman, was born in central Alabama in 1838. 2 years later, the family moved westward again to Kemper County, Mississippi, some 40 miles northwest of Meridian. Meridian will make sense in a moment. Young Sam was only 19 when his father died in 1857. So he went back to Lowndes County, Alabama, to work and farm with relatives. He was there when the Civil War erupted and quickly enlisted on July 3, 1861 as a private in Company B in the 14th Alabama Infantry. He was captured at Gettysburg on the second day of Lee's bloody, doomed assault on the Union lines. He spent almost 2 years as a prisoner of war. Finally, in June 1865, 2 months after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, he was administered the required oath of allegiance to the United States of America, was given a battered Union Army Spencer carbine to replace the British Enfield he had surrendered, and was released. He returned to Mississippi, and Sam took up his father's trade as a carpenter and bridge builder. He later bought land in Lauderdale County near Pine Springs, Mississippi, and married a local woman, Mrs. Virginia Shine Robinson, who had been widowed by the war and left with 2 small daughters. And through luck and hard work, he prospered, and by the 1880s, his land holdings in the area were so large that the Bozeman place was known locally as 16 sections. Eliza was the second of 5 children, born to Sam and Jenny Bozeman. Eliza Bozeman was a frail, sickly child, but she concealed a strong spirit and lively wit. She was born in 1868. Eliza Bozeman was 2 years older than Aaron Rodgers, almost 17 when they began dating in 1884. Aaron Rodgers married Eliza Bozeman on October 18th, and they soon settled into a modest but comfortable frame house on a small plot of land which Sam Bozeman had set aside for them a few hundred yards from his own house. They lived there only temporarily, though, because Aaron was soon promoted to the foreman of the Extra Gang, which is a section crew which operated on an erratic schedule at various locations, often being called away for days at a time to serve as a troubleshooter or maintenance backup on some distant part of the division's line. Whenever circumstances permitted, his new bride followed along, setting up household in a tent or a boxcar on a siding in Lost Gap or Graham Switch or Enterprise, Mississippi, surrounding hamlets that served as rail camps and divisions. Soon, even that irregular routine was further altered and interrupted by the arrival of two sons, Walter Rodgers in 1886 and Talmadge in January 1890. During each time, Eliza returned to her parents at Pine Springs, Mississippi, rejoining her wandering husband as soon as she and the babies were able to travel. Following the birth of Talmadge, however, she suffered two successive miscarriages, and her health, which was never very robust to begin with, began to fail permanently. In all likelihood, she contracted tuberculosis in the raw, shady rail camps where such diseases were common. In her case, was aggravated by the general harshness of her nomadic lifestyle as a railroad section foreman's wife. The intervals at Pine Springs became more and more frequent, and Aaron began to divide his time between railroading and attempts at farming the acreage he had acquired from his father-in-law. And by the mid-1890s, they had more or less taken up residence in the house Sam Bozeman built for them as a wedding present. And it was there, on September 8, 1897, that Eliza Rodgers gave birth to her third and last child. They named him James Charles Rodgers. He was a chubby, brown-eyed baby who quickly became the spoiled favorite of the family. However, it was soon obvious that Eliza Rodgers' health had gotten worse, and her illness had grown chronic. And in 1903, her health deteriorated rapidly, and she died. Jimmie, as he was called, was just 5 or 6. Although various branches of the Bozeman family were close by and offered to take Talmadge and Jimmie, the eldest son, Walter, with then 17, had already joined his father on the railroad. Aaron Rodgers declined and instead sent the boys to live for a time with his relatives at Scuba, Mississippi, and the nearby town of Geiger, Alabama. Jimmie's time living with relatives only lasted a year. Actually, probably even less than that, because Aaron Rodgers remarried in October of 1904. And having once more assumed the responsibilities of a family, Aaron Rodgers left the railroad in 1905 and made an all-out effort to support his wife and children by farming the land he still owned in Pine Springs. However, it was not successful. Following year, the family moved to Lowndes County in the Black Prairie region of northeastern Mississippi. There, Aaron made an ill-attempted fate at running an alfalfa farm. When that venture collapsed, he returned to work on the railroad, first at West Point, Mississippi, and shortly afterward back in Meridian, where he found a job as a section foreman on the New Orleans and Northeastern Railroad. Again, their stay in Meridian was only temporary. Tensions were going strong at home, however, because Jimmie and his brother Tal could not seem to get along with their stepmother. And so Jimmie and Tal were sent to live with their mother's old maid sister, Dora Bozeman, who, upon the death of Sam and Jimmie Bozeman a few years earlier, had been left to preside over 16 sections, which was the old Bozeman home place. And she was, by most accounts, the prototypical old maid. Thin, sharp-faced spinster who seemed to pass immediately from childhood to barren middle-aged. Invariably mirrored in the collective family consciousness as a frumpy stick figure poking about in a sunbonnet and gingham apron, tending gardens, raising chickens, and someone else's children. Jimmie and Tal went to live with their Aunt Dora in 1906, and they were enrolled in school at Pine Springs, Mississippi for the winter term. Before his mother's death, Jimmie had attended a little shanty school at Lost Gap, one of the rail points just west of Meridian, where his father worked for a time. That initial brush with book learning ended abruptly when Eliza Rodgers died, but after Aaron remarried, their schooling began again. He would later move back to Meridian with his father, and soon the show business bug bit him. He won a talent contest at the age of 13, and that same age he had twice organized traveling shows, only to be brought home by his father. First time, he stole some of his sister-in-law's bed sheets to make a crude tent. Upon his return to Meridian, he paid for the sheets with money he had made from his own show. For the second trip, he charged to his father, without his father's knowledge, an expensive canvas tent. And in order to keep the boy at home, Aaron Rodgers found Jimmie his first railroad job as a water boy on his father's section gang. A few years later, Jimmie became a brakeman on the New Orleans and Northeastern Railroad, a position secured by his older brother Walter, who was a conductor on the same line. And during this time period, he found time for other interests. In January of 1917, he was introduced by a friend to a young woman named Stella Kelly in Durant, Mississippi. At that time, he was moving between Jackson, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and during that same year, Stella Kelly and Jimmie Rodgers were married. They divorced 2 years later. It was a young marriage, as Jimmie was only 19 at the time, and it ended because of money trouble. However, he soon hit rebound because in 1920 he married Carrie Williamson, the daughter of a preacher of all things. I guess it's true, opposites do attract. You have one hard-working, tough railroad man, and then you also have this gentle preacher's daughter. Sounds like something right out of a Hollywood movie. In fact, I don't know why no one has ever bothered to make a movie about Jimmie Rodgers' life. I'd love to see it. Somebody do it! Anyway, back to the story. At the age of 27 in 1924, Jimmie contracted tuberculosis. The disease temporarily ended his railroad career, but gave him a chance to go back to his first love, showbiz. So he organized a traveling road show and performed across the southeast until a tornado destroyed his tent. So he returned to railroad work as a brakeman on the east coast of Florida. But eventually, tuberculosis cost him his job. So he relocated to Tucson, Arizona. At the time, it was believed that a dry climate would lessen the effects of tuberculosis, and he worked as a switchman for the Southern Pacific. The job lasted less than a year, and the Rodgers family, which by then included Carrie and their daughter Anita, settled back in Meridian in 1927. Later that year, Jimmie traveled to Asheville, North Carolina, and in February 1927, Asheville's first radio station, WWNC, went on the air, and on April the 18th, Jimmie Rodgers and Otis Kuykendall performed for the first time on that station, albeit they were unpaid. And this soon evolved into a regular spot, and he persuaded the Geneva Ramblers, a string band from Bristol, Tennessee, to join him as the Jimmie Rodgers Entertainers. When the radio program had abruptly ended, they found work at a resort in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was there that they learned that Ralph Peer, who was an A&R man for the Victor Talking Machine Company, we talked about him last episode, was making field recordings in Bristol, Tennessee, which happened to be not far away. So Jimmie quickly loaded up the band, went to Bristol, and succeeded in gaining an audition with Ralph Peer. Before they could record, however, the group quarreled over billing and broke up. Rodgers had been deserted by his own band, so he persuaded Jimmie to let him record alone, accompanied only by his own guitar. And so, on August 4th, 1927, Jimmie recorded 2 songs, Sleep Baby Sleep and The Soldier's Sweetheart, and for the recordings he received $100. These recordings were released on October 7th, 1927, to modest success. However, in November of that year, Peer recorded Rodgers again at the Victor Studios in Camden, New Jersey. 4 songs made it out of the session: Ben Dewberry's Final Run, Mother Was a Lady, Away Out on the Mountain, and the ever-popular T for Texas. In the next 2 years, T for Texas, which was released as Blue Yodel, sold nearly 500,000 copies, and this rocketed him towards stardom. And interestingly, he began to sing about his own problems, including his trouble with tuberculosis. He recorded not 1 but 2 songs about his trouble with the disease, which would later take his life: Whippin' That Old TB and TB Blues. And what's always interested me is that the songs are almost polar opposite. Whippin' That Old TB is basically him saying, I've got the disease, so what? I'm gonna fight it, and I'm gonna win. And TB Blues is the exact opposite. To me, it almost sounds like a plea. Basically him saying, okay, I can't go on, I can't fight anymore, too tired to fight. And of course, these themes of struggle have definitely carried on into country music. And the next few years following 1927, Jimmie Rodgers did a movie short called The Singin' Brakeman and made various recordings across the country. He toured the Midwest with humorist Will Rodgers, and on July 16th, 1930, he recorded Blue Yodel No. 9, also called Standing on the Corner, with a young jazz trumpeter named Louis Armstrong, whose wife Lillian also played piano on the track. However, it was obvious during these years that Jimmie was not healthy. It was obvious that tuberculosis was getting the better of him, and Jimmie's next to last recordings were made in August 1932 in Camden, New Jersey. He had given up touring by then, but he did have a weekly radio show in San Antonio, Texas, where he'd relocated when T for Texas became a hit. In 1933, Jimmie traveled to New York for recording sessions beginning May 17th. He completed 4 songs on the first take, but there was no question that he was running out of time. When he returned to the studio after a day's rest, he had to record sitting down and soon retreated to his hotel, hoping to regain enough energy to finish the songs he'd been rehearsing. The recording engineer hired 2 session musicians to help him when he came back to the studio a few days later. Together, they recorded a few songs, including Mississippi Delta Blues, and for his last song of the session, he recorded a song called Years Ago by himself, finishing as he'd started just 6 years earlier, just a man and his guitar. But within 36 hours, he was dead, only 35. And so it was, the life of America's blue yodeler had ended. But he would go on to inspire country singers from Ernest Tubb to Merle Haggard and everywhere in between. I would like to thank the Country Music Hall of Fame's website, the Jimmie Rodgers Museum's website, and Nolan Porterfield's definitive biography of the singing brakeman. And yes, that's what Jimmie was called. Jimmie Rodgers, The Life and Times of America's Blue Yodel. Goodbye, God bless, and yodeling, yodeling, yodeling.